Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're stepping into some truly profound territory. We're going to unpack a heavy, deeply philosophical theme centered all around geopolitical morality. Specifically, we're looking at that painful, messy space that exists right between fear and restraint. And we'll be using the incredibly complex dynamic between Iran, America, and the broader Middle East as our lens to do it. It's the kind of topic that shapes the news you read every morning, the economy you live in, and, honestly, it forces us to question our very definitions of peace, conflict, and the absolute human toll of power. Okay, let's dive into this. Václav Havel poses a gripping and frankly almost uncomfortable question: is a bad peace better than a good war? Now, peace is such a beautiful word, right? And war is a terrible one. But what the source material points out here is that a beautiful word can sometimes hide a really terrible danger. I mean, if a so-called peace simply gives rulers more money, gives violence more time to organize, and leaves prisoners living in constant fear, well, then it might just be danger wearing a mask. To navigate through these dense geopolitical woods, we've got a clear roadmap. We're going to explore 6 key areas in a sort of great debate format. We'll look at the peace versus war dilemma, the price of containment, the regime versus the people, the proxy battlefield, the war for the mind, and finally, the human cost. So let's kick things off with Section 1, the peace versus war dilemma. To really understand this dilemma, we have to define our terms. The diplomat George Kennan gives us a highly precise and honestly fascinating definition of appeasement. He argues it isn't simply the act of talking to an enemy because, diplomacy naturally requires communication. Rather, appeasement is losing your strategic memory. It's failing to see the enemy clearly. Think of it kind of like forgetting that the tiger sitting across the table from you is still, in fact, a tiger. A serious nation can negotiate and resist at the exact same time. But the real danger pops up when we completely lose sight of the true nature of who we're actually dealing with. And this leads us directly to a really stark contrast in diplomatic strategy. On one side, you have the pragmatism of James Baker. He argues that a deal must actually test a regime's real-world behavior, not just listen to their speeches. Like, a pause in firing isn't actually peace if militias are actively still being armed, right? On the flip side, you have John Bolton, who warns that hostile regimes literally use time as a weapon. In his view, a bad agreement is way worse than no agreement at all, because adversaries just sign the piece of paper, regroup, and rebuild. Just consider the immense weight on policymakers here. Do you test a regime's behavior through a deal, or do you risk giving an adversary the exact time they need to grow stronger? Moving on to Section 2, the price of containment. So if we decide we aren't going to go to war, but instead we use economic tools to contain a regime, we have to ask a brutally hard question. Who truly pays the price? Let's look at the economic consensus from thinkers like Milton Friedman and Thomas Sowell. Both of them highlight that broad economic pressure so often misses its intended target. Friedman notes that cutting off trade can actually make ordinary citizens entirely dependent on the state, which ironically empowers rulers with total control over scarcity. And Sowell points out that sanctions often just create massive black markets. To put that into perspective, a really surprising reality is that during the 1990s sanctions on Iraq, regime insiders are making billions of dollars through smuggling while the general public literally starved. The goal of weakening tyranny is obviously noble, but the actual mechanics, they are incredibly messy. Which brings this whole abstract, high-level policy debate crashing right back down to earth with a thought from Dorothy Day. I cannot look at a hungry child and call it policy. It's such a powerful human anchor. We really have to question if containment, especially when it restricts medicine, food, or basic human needs, can ever truly be called merciful. It forces us to ask if free nations can somehow aim their pressure directly at the machinery of oppression without ever forgetting the faces of the oppressed. Let's move to Section 3, the regime versus the people. To grasp this dynamic, we have to deconstruct the idea of national identity itself and ask, who actually gets to speak for a nation, like Iran? We find this profound dialectical clash. Reza Pahlavi argues that the culture, the history, and the dignity of the Iranian people are entirely distinct from the current regime. He claims that loving the country literally means refusing to let the state own the nation's name. But conversely, Ruhollah Khomeini argues that a nation is absolutely inseparable from its revolution. He asserts that the state was born directly from the sacrifice and religious will of the people to reject foreign domination. These two views perfectly illustrate a massive fundamental disagreement over whether a state and its people are essentially the exact same entity or two completely different forces. And this identity clash leads us straight into the difference between loving a country and just blindly obeying its rulers. Natan Sharansky draws a really brilliant, sharp line here. He says, in a free society, true patriotism actually requires and allows for criticism of the government. But in a dictatorship, that exact same criticism is immediately labeled as treason. It's an absolutely vital distinction. A regime demands obedience, but a nation deserves love. That brings us to Section 4, the proxy battlefield. We have to examine the tragic reality of what happens when smaller nations become the bloody chessboards of much larger geopolitical powers. A critical concept for understanding the modern Middle East is occupation by proxy, a term described by Condoleezza Rice. It happens when an armed group within a country ends up answering more to a foreign patron than to its own citizens or its own government. This dynamic shows us how the noble, inspiring language of resistance can actually mask a form of foreign occupation. It effectively destroys a smaller nation's sovereignty and its civic trust, completely from the inside out. And as you'd expect, the debate around these proxy conflicts is incredibly intense. Noam Chomsky critiques this whole thing as imperial manipulation, famously stating that proxy war is often direct war with a mask. Basically, larger states using smaller factions to do their dirty work while totally denying responsibility. But in stark contrast, we have Golda Meir's fierce defense of a nation's absolute right to survive. She argues that any so-called resistance that deliberately targets civilians immediately loses all moral protection. When rockets are flying and borders start to blur, the very definitions of defense, empire, and survival become highly, highly contested ground. Let's jump into Section 5, the war for the mind. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is that it shows us the danger isn't just physical anymore. Just listen to George Orwell's timeless warning about the weaponization of moral language. Compassion is being used against a society when language is bent until cruelty sounds merciful and surrender sounds wise. It's chilling, right? Because the threat isn't always a foreign army rolling across a physical border. Often, it's a carefully crafted narrative crossing a digital screen. It's designed to make free people completely unable to tell the difference between truth, manipulation, and genuine empathy. Building right on Orwell, two vastly different thinkers arrive at the exact same crucial conclusion here. Malcolm X warns that manipulation happens when your pain is selected for you. You know, when some suffering is highlighted as this massive injustice, while other suffering is just treated as background noise. Hannah Arendt adds to this, saying that compassion becomes outright dangerous when it completely replaces critical judgment. Both of them are telling us something super important. Free speech and empathy are absolutely vital, yes, but they must never, ever lead us to surrender our capacity for objective, critical thought. And finally, Section 6, remembering the human costs. After all this complex philosophy and high-level geopolitical strategy, we really have to synthesize this information and bring it back down to the individuals who are actually caught in the crossfire. Nobel laureate Shirin Ebadi issues this profound plea to just cut through all the noise. She says, when we speak about Iran, we must begin with the people. Because if we don't start right there, our geopolitical policy becomes way too clean, way too abstract. War just becomes strategy, and sanctions just become numbers on a spreadsheet. We literally have to look past the giant state apparatus and see the real human beings living underneath it. And who exactly are those human beings? Well, it's the prisoner locked away simply for their thoughts. It's the mother waiting outside the jail, the child in Lebanon living under the constant threat of conflict, the family in Israel rushing to a bomb shelter. It's the American citizen who is just exhausted and afraid of yet another endless overseas war. And it's the Iranian girl who simply wants a future where her choices are finally her own. True moral clarity requires us to somehow hold all of these individuals in our minds simultaneously when we try to evaluate global power. Ultimately, we are left with this utterly devastating summary of the impossible trade-offs of power. A bad peace may leave the prisons full. A good war may fill the graves. It perfectly and tragically encapsulates the immense, almost unbearable weight of these decisions. There are absolutely no easy answers here, no clean victories. Both action and inaction carry a truly terrifying human cost. Which leaves us with one final lingering question to end this explainer on today. Can our politics still remember the human being? When the slogans get really loud and the strategies get incredibly complex, can we somehow keep our focus firmly on the people whose lives actually hang in the balance? I'm going to leave you to think on that. Thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive, and as always, keep asking the hard questions.